Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. Today we're diving into the actual official investigation reports of real-world aviation accidents. Our goal here? To see exactly how minor systemic gaps, things that just seem like tiny administrative oversights, can suddenly compound into absolute disasters. Right now, we're cracking open the final investigation report from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau regarding a Tecnam P2008JC training aircraft.
Okay, picture this. It's a completely perfect day at Baramati Airport in India, September 20, 2021. The weather is beautiful, winds are perfectly calm, but this idyllic morning violently ends with a training aircraft flipped completely upside down on the grass next to the runway, with a 29-year-old student pilot suspended upside down by his harness. So how on earth does a totally routine training flight end up completely inverted?
Section 1, Anatomy of an Accident. A perfect morning turns upside down.
To understand how this plane ended up on its roof, we've got to trace the exact steps of this 29-year-old student pilot on his fourth solo check. That means he flies a few circuits with an instructor to prove he's ready, and then he's released to fly the aircraft completely alone. If we look at the timeline, at 0508 UTC, he completes his medical declaration and pre-flight briefing. Boom, moving along. At 0655, chocks are pulled, and he takes off with his instructor. For the next 45 minutes, they fly 4 absolutely perfect circuits. The instructor notes every approach is stabilized, every single touchdown is incredibly smooth. By 0740, the instructor is super satisfied, steps out of the cockpit, and heads up to the air traffic control tower to watch his student fly solo. Everything is progressing flawlessly, right up until 0830 UTC when disaster strikes.
Section 2, Ruling out the suspects, the usual culprits.
When an aircraft crashes, investigators immediately start looking at the usual suspects, right? Was it a sudden storm, a drunk pilot, maybe a sudden engine failure? But as we build our mystery here and look at the actual data, we can quickly start crossing these common causes right off the list. See that massive zero? That is the pilot's breath analyzer result. Completely sober. And not just that, his medical was perfectly up to date, he had a full 72 hours of rest before the flight, and his paperwork was spotless. He was fully qualified to be sitting in that left seat.
So, the usual culprits? Entirely absent. The weather was strictly visual meteorological conditions. Visibility was great, crosswinds were well below limits. The pilot was fit, and crucially, the Tecnam aircraft had zero, and I mean zero, mechanical defects. Actually, investigators noted that when the plane's nose hit the ground, the wooden propeller blades shattered and scattered in a way that proved the Rotax engine was delivering high power at the very moment of impact. The engine hadn't quit. It was literally roaring.
Section 3. The critical few seconds. The micro moments of disaster.
Okay, so if the weather was fine, the pilot was perfectly capable, and the plane was functionally flawless, we really have to zoom in on the microseconds right after touchdown. The pilot had completed a totally normal left-hand circuit, got his landing clearance, and made what eyewitnesses, including his instructor up in the tower, described as a perfectly smooth touchdown on runway 29. But here is where the whole sequence completely breaks down. After rolling on the main wheels and nose gear for just 3, maybe 4 seconds, the student pilot felt the aircraft balloon, meaning it unexpectedly lifted back up slightly into the air. Now, instead of trying to force a bad landing, he initiated an emergency procedure known in aviation as a bulked landing or a go-around. Basically, he pushed the throttle forward to climb back into the sky. And on paper, deciding to go around is exactly what a safe pilot should do. But let's look at what the pilot actually did versus the official Tecnam aircraft flight manual. To execute a bulked landing properly, yes, you push the power to max, but you absolutely must retract the wing flaps from the landing position back up to the takeoff position. Landing flaps create massive aerodynamic drag. So the pilot slammed on full power, but he completely forgot to retract those flaps. He just left them fully extended. Because of that immense drag, the aircraft pitched up wildly, bled off its airspeed, stalled, dropped its left wing, and smashed violently back into the earth. Which immediately raises a massive question for the crash investigators, right? Why did this happen? Why would a highly capable student pilot, who had literally just flown 4 perfect circuits under the strict supervision of his instructor an hour earlier, completely freeze up? Why forget a highly critical step, leave the flaps down, and essentially cause his own plane to stall?
Section 4, the missing training link, the root cause.
Well, investigators didn't just look at the wreckage. They looked at the Flight Academy's official training procedure manual. That's the actual rule book that dictates exactly what student pilots are taught before they're ever allowed to fly solo. And guys, the report drops an absolute bombshell. The pilot failed to configure the flaps correctly because bulk landings were simply not a practice part of the pre-solo training syllabus. Seriously, the flight manual created by the aircraft manufacturer explicitly demands a specific flap procedure to survive a go-around, but the Academy's training syllabus never actually required the student to practice it in the air before flying alone.
Just think about what this actually means for a student in that cockpit. In a high-stress, split-second emergency, when the runway is literally running out beneath you and the plane isn't doing what you expect, cognitive thought just shuts down and muscle memory takes over. But this pilot's muscle memory failed entirely, simply because he had never physically rehearsed this exact emergency sequence with an instructor. He had never been forced to build that physical, automatic habit of reaching for the flap switch while simultaneously applying full throttle.
Section 5. Lessons for Aviation Safety. Systemic Gaps and Fixes. It's an old saying that aviation safety regulations are written in blood and bent metal, and this accident perfectly illustrates how a crash is rarely ever just one mistake. It's an accumulation of minor procedural gaps that suddenly compound into a terrifying event. The gap between what the aircraft manufacturer required and what the flight school actually taught was the fatal flaw here. But wait, there's more. The investigation exposed several other broken layers of defense within the Academy's operations. For instance, the pilot never prepared mandated solo load and trim sheet before taking off. The Flight Academy had totally failed to install mandated CCTV cameras, which would have visually captured the entire accident sequence. And most shockingly, the Tecnam aircraft features these highly advanced Garmin glass displays that can record every single flight metric to an SD card, but the Academy simply didn't put SD cards into the slots. This meant investigators were essentially flying blind when trying to determine the plane's exact speed at the exact moment of the stall. So, to ensure a systemic training gap like this never ever slips through the cracks again, the investigation authorities recommended some critical fixes. They demanded the enforcement of ATC radio recordings, they mandated the installation of CCTVs, and required that flight schools actually use those SD cards to track and review student flight data. But most importantly, they recommended permanently adding the bulked landing procedure right into the early pre-solo flight instruction syllabus across the board. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to really chew on. We so often jump to blame the pilot when a plane crashes, but when the official aircraft engineering manual demands a critical, life-saving action, and the regulatory-approved training syllabus somehow entirely ignores teaching it, who is really responsible when a 29-year-old student ends up completely upside down in the grass? Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you.